In the dim half-light of morning, when the frost still clung to the grass and the breath of the earth rose like smoke, the first people stirred. They were not kings or warriors of legend, nor farmers who tilled the soil, nor merchants who counted coins. They were wanderers, bound to the land by hunger and season, their days carved by the rhythm of sun and fire. Life for them was neither grand nor noble. It was survival. Each dawn began with the same question: where would food be found? And how would death be kept at bay for another night? Theirs was not a world of walls or roofs, but of caves and overhangs, of branches lashed together with sinew, of fires that must never go out lest darkness swallow them whole. And yet, in the world of danger and cold, there was also a kind of beauty. The crackle of a fire, the smell of roasted meat, the laughter of children tumbling in the dirt, the first smear of ochre on a cave wall. All these spoke of a people who were more than beasts. They were human, and being human meant more than clawing at life. It meant shaping it, remembering it, passing it forward. We cannot know their thoughts, not truly, but we can imagine. We can trace their hands pressed into clay thousands of years ago, see the soot from their fires staining the rock, hold the flint blades they shaped and wore down with use. These fragments whisper stories that no tongue remembers, but every heart can guess. Let us walk into their world. The morning hunt began with silence. From a shallow cave overlooking a valley of grass, 5 figures emerged. They were wrapped in hides, their hair long and tangled, their faces streaked with ash. The leader, tall, broad-shouldered, a scar cutting across his brow, carried a spear tipped with sharpened bone. His name, passed in murmurs by his people, was Kor. Beside him walked Lyra, his mate, her arms strong from grinding grain and hauling wood. She carried a sling and a pouch of smooth stones. 2 young hunters trailed them, brothers, lean and restless, eager to prove themselves. Behind all came the elder, a bent man with cloudy eyes, his hands gnarled but still clutching the staff. His voice was weak, yet his memory stretched farther than the hills. They moved together into the tall grass, their breath steaming, their eyes alert. Somewhere ahead, deer grazed. Somewhere ahead, food waited, or hunger. Ko or raised his hand, and they froze. The wind shifted, carrying the musk of animals. They crouched, inching forward, hearts pounding like drums. For hours they crept, until at last they saw them. A herd of red deer, heads bowed to graze. Ears twitching at every sound, the hunt began. Stones flew from Lyra's sling, cracking against the ground, startling the herd. The brothers darted wide, shouting, waving their arms, driving the animals toward Kor's spear. The deer bolted, muscles rippling, hooves striking sparks on stone. One young stag turned to late. Kor lunged, his spear driving deep. The animal cried once, then fell. The hunters roared in triumph. But triumph was never without cost. One of the brothers slipped on wet grass, fell beneath a stampede of hooves. When they pulled him free, his leg was broken, twisted like dry wood. He would not walk again for many moons. They carried both stag and brother back to the cave. The kill meant meat, marrow, sending for cords, high for warmth. The injury meant another mouth unable to hunt, another weight upon the group. Yet no one spoke of leaving him behind. He was theirs, and they were his. Survival was not only strength, it was also loyalty. The night, the fire burned bright. Children gnawed at roasted marrow bones. Women scraped hide with flint. The elder told of hunts long past, and on the cave wall, Lyra smeared fresh ochre, painting the shape of a deer with spreading antlers. Red as blood. The boy with a broken leg lay near the fire, his eyes wide with pain, but also pride. He had hunted, and he had lived. Tomorrow he would not walk, but tonight he was part of the story. This was life at the dawn of firelight, hunger, and danger. Yes, but also memory, loyalty, and the first spark of art. In their struggle, we glimpse ourselves, not as kings or conquerors, but as people, forever chasing the fire through the dark. Fire was life, To lose it was death. The people knew this truth better than any prayer or story. They had no matches, no flint spark at hand whenever they pleased. A fire, once lit, had to be kept alive, carried like a treasure, guarded as though it were a child. At night, to always remain awake, feeding embers with scraps of wood and dried grass. When storms lashed the hills with rain, they built shelters of hides and branches, crouching over the flame like mothers shielding their newborns. To let it die meant long hours of desperation, grinding sticks together, striking stones in hope, praying that smoke would come before hunger or wolves. It was Lyra who carried the fire when they moved. She bore it in a hollowed gourd, lined with ash, the coals glowing faintly within. She walked with careful steps, as though each one carried the weight of the world. The children whispered that the fire obeyed her, that her hands never trembled. One winter, when the snow lay deep and the sky gave no mercy, the fire nearly died. The storm had raged for 3 days, and all the dry wood was gone. The hunters returned with nothing but frostbite on their fingers. The wind howled through the cave, and the flames dwindled to embers. The elder's voice, thin but steady, broke the silence. We must feed it with what we have. So they stripped their own furs, broke spear shafts, even tore the handles from their tools. Piece by piece, they gave to the fire what had once protected them. The children cried, but the flames leapt again, golden and warm. When the storm passed, the people were thin and shivering, but the fire still lived. And because it lived, so did they die in the evenings when bellies were full enough for stories. The elder spoke of the time before fire. His words carried memory older than any face among them. In the first days, he said, men were prey. The beasts ruled the dark. We huddled in the cold, our skin torn by teeth, our bones cracked for marrow. But then lightning struck a tree, and men stole the flame. We fed it, we kept it, and the beasts fled. From that day, man walked upright, not as hunted, but as hunter. Children listened with wide eyes, the light flickering on their faces. They believed as surely as they believed in hunger and night. For them, fire was not a tool. It was proof that they were chosen, different from beasts. Lyra painted this truth on the cave walls. With red ochre and black soot, she drew a circle of fire, men standing around it, their hands raised. She placed a mark for each of them, Kor with his spear, the brothers, the elder with his staff, herself with a sling, and above all, she painted the fire as a living thing, its arms stretching like branches into the night. There were times when the fire demanded sacrifice. One night, a great wind swept down from the mountains. The flames hissed and bent low. Sparks fled into the dark, and smoke filled the cave. The people coughed and cried out. Kor ordered them to drag the fire outside, though the snow stung like knives. Together they carried the embers into the storm, building stone walls with frozen fingers, piling wood in desperate handfuls. By dawn, the fire burned bright again, though many fingers were blistered and raw, but none cursed, for they had faced death and kept their heart alive. It was Matthew, the boy with the broken leg, who gave the fire a name. He sat near it always, his useless limbs stretched before him, and whispered to the flames as though they listened. You are ash breath, he told it. You eat what we give, and in return, you breathe warmth into us. The name clung, passed from mouth to mouth. Soon even the elder called the fire ash breath, as though it were a spirit, a god in their midst. And perhaps it was, for without ash breath, there would be no warmth, no roasted meat, no stories, no paintings, no laughter. Without it, they would have been beasts among beasts. With it, they were something else. They were human. They were not kings nor warriors, not yet. They were children, but even the youngest carried the weight of survival on their small shoulders. There were no schools, no walls painted with words, no teachers to guide them with rules and letters. The world itself was the teacher, and its lessons were harsh. Hunger was the first lesson. Cold was the second. Death was the third. The little ones learned quickly, or they did not live long. From the moment they could walk, They were given tasks. A toddler might gather dry grass for tinder, his tiny hands fumbling but persistent. A girl barely taller than her mother's knee carried water in a carved shell, careful not to spill a drop. Boys and girls alike watched their elders strike stone against stone, shaping a sharp edge, and their fingers itched to try. Games were not just games. Children chased each other through the tall grass, but in their play they learned to move silently, to stalk without snapping a twig. They threw small stones at tree trunks, laughing when they missed. But each throw trained their eyes and arms for the hunt. Even the songs they sang around the fire carried memory, chants that spoke of animals, rivers, storms. A child's voice, cracked and high, was also a vessel of knowledge. One boy, named Jor, was famous in the group for his quick feet. He was no taller than a spear shaft, his hair tangled like roots, but he could dart between rocks faster than rabbits. The others called him Swiftfoot, and he bore the name proudly. One evening, when the hunters returned empty-handed and stomachs growled with anger, Jor disappeared into the night. His mother wept, thinking wolves had taken him. But before dawn, the boy stumbled back, carrying a fat hare by the ears. He had seen where it hid among the stones and caught it with his bare hands. Teeth sunk deep into its neck. The people roared with laughter and pride, and though the hare was small, the story was great. From that night on, Jor sat closer to the fire, his eyes bright with the pride of a true hunter. But not every story was of triumph. There was a girl, Nira, who followed her mother to the river one summer. The water ran low, trickling between stones, and fish gleamed in the shallows. Nira reached with eager hands, her face reflected in the ripples. Then the river swelled suddenly, a surge from the mountains, and swept her off her feet. Her mother screamed and lunged, but the current pulled the girl away. It was Kor himself who dove in, spear still in hand, fighting the water with every stroke. He dragged her back, coughing and limp, her tiny body heavy with river water. They pressed her chest, breathed into her mouth, prayed to ash breath for warmth. At last, she sputtered, vomited water, and cried. That night, Lyra painted the scene on the wall. A girl and a wave, a man pulling her free. Above it, she drew the sun, blazing red. The elders spoke softly. The river gives, and the river takes. We must teach the children to see its moods. Nira lived, but she never forgot the roar of the water. Even grown, she shivered at its sound. Childhood was brief. By the time a boy's voice cracked, he was expected to join the hunt. By the time a girl bled her first blood, she was a woman gathering roots, weaving fibers, carrying infants on her hip. But brief though it was, childhood mattered. Around the fire, children's laughter was the only thing that cut through the hunger, the fear. Their games, their songs, their wide-eyed questions reminded the others why they fought so hard to live. In their small bodies burned the promise of tomorrow. The elder once told them, "You are not just children. You are the fire carried forward. Without you, the flame dies, and all our steps vanish like smoke." And so the children listened, learned, stumbled, and rose again. They carried stones, they fetched water, they scraped hides. They whispered to ash breath as though it were their friend. And in time, some would hunt, some would paint, some would tell the stories. But all of them, kept the fire alive. They were the keepers of memory, the givers of life, the hands that shaped each day. If the hunters were the sharp edge of the spear, women and elders were the shaft, the part that bore the weight, steady and constant. Without them, no hunt, no fire, no story would last. The work of women's lives were carved by an ending labor. At dawn, before the hunters rose, they gathered sticks for fuel, fetched water from the stream, checked the embers of ash breath. Some knelt to grind seeds or roots between stones, turning the earth's gifts into paste, flour, or broth. Others wove sinew into cords, twisted grass into rope, or scraped hides with flint until they were soft enough to wear. Their hands never stopped moving. When one task ended, another began. A woman could carry a child on her hip while working the hide stretched across her knee. She could sing a lullaby while pounding roots with a stone pestle. Lyra, made of core, was the strongest among them. Her arms were scarred from firewood, her palms rough from scraping hides. Yet there was gentleness in her too. She knew which herbs soothed fevers, which roots eased birth pains, which leaves drove away insects. When a child coughed through the night, it was Lyra who chewed bitter plants and spat the paste into the mother's hand. The birth of life birth was sacred and dangerous. There were no midwives, no herbs strong enough to banish death entirely. A woman in labor balanced between two worlds, her screams echoing against stone walls, her blood soaking into furs. One winter, a girl named Sarah gave birth. She was young, barely into womanhood, her belly round with her first child. The women gathered around her, chanting low, their hands pressing her back, their voices weaving courage. Outside, the men waited in silence, for life and death hung in the air together. Sarah cried out, her face pale with pain. But Lyra knelt beside her, gripping her hand, whispering, "Breathe, push, the child comes." Hours passed, each moment endless. At last, a cry split the night, high, thin, but alive. A boy, small and red, his fists clenched tight. The women cheered. Lyra lifted the child to the fire, showing him to ash breath as though the flame itself must see him first. The men shouted in relief, and though Sarah lay weak, her eyes half closed, she smiled faintly, her hand resting on the newborn's chest. But not all births ended so. Another woman, Mira, died in labor, her child stillborn. The cries that night were not of joy, but grief. They buried her at dawn, her body wrapped in hide, her name painted in black soot upon the cave wall. Life and death lived side by side. The people learned to carry both. The elders were not strong in body, but in memory. Their spines bent, their eyes clouded, their teeth worn to stubs, yet their voices were sharp. They were living libraries, keepers of seasons, guides through storms. The oldest among them, called Oric, could no longer hunt, but his tongue was keen. He remembered when the river swelled and drowned half the herd, when the mountain gave fire from its belly, when wolves came in winter and stole children. Each night, his stories poured into young ears. The earth remembers, he would say, tapping his staff. It leaves marks for those who look. The stones, the trees, the stars, they speak. Learn to listen, and you will not starve. Children sat at his feet, their mouths open, eyes wide. Even Kor, proud and scarred, sometimes bent his head to Oric's words. For strength might win food, but memory kept a people alive. The burial of the elder when Oric died. It was winter again. His body wasted away, breath rattling like dry leaves, but his eyes burned bright until the end. Before he passed, he called for Matthew, the boy with the broken leg. "You are marked," he rasped, "not by wound alone. You are chosen to remember. Carry the fire in your heart. Speak it, paint it, so that when I am dust, I still live." Matthew nodded, tears streaking his face. Oric died that night, his hand still clutching the boy's died at dawn. They carried the elder's body to the hill above the cave. They dug into frozen soil, laid him wrapped in furs, and placed beside him his staff, his flint, and a piece of ochre. Lyra smeared red across his forehead, whispering, "Go with fire." The people sang low, voices trembling. Then the earth closed over him, and the snow fell, covering his grave. Matthew, limping, carved a mark on the wall that night, a circle, within it a line like a path, stretching onward. It was not Oric's face, nor his body, but his journey. And for the first time, Matthew's hands painted, his soul carrying memory. Mothers and elders together with mothers gave life. The elders gave meaning. Between them, the people were bound that the hunters might fall, the children might stumble. But so long as women bore children and elders spoke stories, the tribe endured. One night, when food was scarce and spirits low, Marta whispered, "We are not beasts. Beasts eat and die. We give birth. We remember." That is the difference. The fire cracked, sparks rising. The people nodded, and though hunger gnawed at their bellies, they felt strong. Hunting was the heart of their world. Without the hunt, there was no meat, no hides for warmth, no sinew for cords, no bones for tools. Without the hunt, there was only hunger, and hunger was death. Every hunt was a gamble against the wilderness itself. A single slip, a single mistake, and a hunter could become prey. They knew the earth gave, but the earth also took, and the balance was never kind. The gathering before the hunting, the morning of the great hunt, the sky hung low and gray. Mist curled across the valley, swallowing the trees in silence. The hunters gathered near the cave's mouth. Their weapons lay before them, spears tipped with stone and bone, slings with pouches of smooth river stones, knives chipped sharp as teeth. Kor, the leader, spoke little, but his presence was command enough. He checked each spear with careful hands, testing the bindings, tugging at the sinew cords. His scar caught the faint light, a reminder of hunts past, of mistakes survived. The younger hunter stood restless. Swift-foot Jor bounced on his heels, eager to prove himself again. Nira, now older, her hair bound in braids, held her sling tightly. Her eyes burned with the memory of nearly drowning in the river. She longed to prove her strength in other ways. The elder hunters were quieter. Elias, his beard streaked with gray, muttered prayers under his breath. Gray, broad and steady, sharpened his blade against stone, the rasping sound steady as his breath. Behind them, the women watched silently, their faces carved with worry. Each knew the hunt gave life, but it also stole it. For every stag brought home, a man might not return. The Stockty moved into the valley, silent shadows among the grass. The mist clung to their skin, cold and damp. Birds stirred in the trees, wings flashing pale against the gloom. Hours passed in near silence. They followed tracks, the soft press of hooves in mud, the snapped twigs, the faint musk of animals in the wind. Jor darted ahead, his quick feet carrying him silently across stones. Kor raised his hand often, slowing the group, reminding them that eagerness killed more hunters than teeth dot at last. They saw them, a herd of oryx, massive beasts with horns curved like the crescent moon. Their hides were dark, their eyes fierce, their breath steaming in the cold. They grazed near the riverbank, tails flicking at flies. The hunters crouched in the grass, hearts thundering. These were no gentle deer. Oryx could trample a man into the earth, could gore him with horns longer than a spear. But the meat of one beast could feed the tribe for many days. The risk was life. The reward, survival. The chaser gave the signal. Stones whistled from slings, striking the ground, cracking against hides. The herd bellowed and bolted, earth shaking beneath their hooves. Hunters spread wide, shouting, waving, driving them toward a narrow gorge where escape would be harder. The ground trembled. Jor ran too far ahead, his pride faster than his wisdom. One bull turned suddenly, enraged, and charged. The boy froze. Kor lunged, his spear braced. The bull thundered closer, horns lowered, its roar splitting the valley. At the last moment, Kor thrust. The stone tip drove deep into the beast's shoulder. The bull staggered, bellowing, blood spraying hot and red. The other hunters rushed in, stabbing, shouting. The bull collapsed in a fury of muscle and earth, its last breath rattling like thunder. The herd fled, dust rising, their cries echoing through the valley. The hunters stood gasping, their arms shaking with effort. Jor stared wide-eyed at the beast's carcass, his chest heaving. "You ran too far," Kor growled, gripping the boy's shoulder. "Your feet are fast, but your mind must be faster. Next time, you die." Jor nodded, shame burning in his eyes. But he also looked at the bull, huge, fallen, and he understood both fear and pride. The Returthi skinned the oryx with stone knives, their hands slick with blood. The hide was heavy, the meat thicker than any deer. They cut until their arms trembled, dividing flesh and marrow, saving sinew and bone. The women and children came to help carry. Together, they bore the weight back to the cave, their steps slow but triumphant. That night, the fire roared higher than ever, Fat sizzled on the flames, smoke curling toward the stars. Children gnawed at marrow bones, grease dripping down their faces. The hunters sat in silence, exhaustion heavy on their limbs, but their eyes glowed with victory. Lyra painted the bull on the wall, its horns like moons, its eyes wide even in death. She painted Kor beside it, spear thrust deep, and Jor small at his side. The story would outlive them, carved in stone, burned into memory. The cost of the hunt, not every hunt ended in triumph. Once, in the depth of winter, they tracked a herd of deer across frozen ground. Hunger gnawed them hollow, their ribs sharp against skin. The deer were swift, their hooves barely touching ice. The hunters ran until their lungs burned, until breath tore their throats raw. Then Elias slipped. His foot struck a hidden crack, and the ice split. He plunged into the black water, the river swallowing him whole. The hunters screamed, pulling at his arms, but the current dragged him under. They saw his face once, white, eyes wide, and then he was gone. They returned that night with nothing. No deer, no meat, only grief. Marta, his mate, sat silent by the fire, her face stone. Lyra painted not a deer, but a dark line across the wall, a black wave swallowing a man. The children cried, asking why the river had taken him. The elder only shook his head. The hunt gives, he said. The hunt takes. This is its way. Lessons of the hunt people understood more than ever. That hunting was not only survival, it was their teacher. It taught patience, courage, fear, and loss. It taught Jordan not to run ahead of wisdom. It taught Nira to steady her sling, to strike not with anger but with calm. It taught Kor that leadership was not only killing, but keeping others alive. And each hunt, painted on the wall, became more than food. It became story, memory, warning. In the red and black of ochre, in the flicker of firelight, the people of stone and bone wrote their history not in words, but in blood and paint. The people had always thought the valley belonged to them. It was where their ancestors had hunted, where the elders' bones rested beneath stone and earth, where the children painted their first marks on the cave wall. But the world was wide, and men were many. Sooner or later, paths would cross. The first sight it began on a day heavy with summer heat. The river lay low, its banks cracked with dryness, fish hiding in deeper pools. Matthew, now taller though still limping, walked with the women to fetch water. They carried skin bags and gourds, laughing softly despite the heat. Then Matthew stopped. His eyes, sharper than most, caught movement across the river. Shapes, people. They were not from his tribe. Their skins were darker, their hair bound high with strips of hide. They carried spears longer than Kor's, tipped with gleaming bone. One woman wore a necklace of shells, white against her chest. Matthew's breath caught. He tugged Lyra's arm, whispering, "Look." The women froze. The stranger stood silent, watching across the water. For a long time, only the river moved, its trickle breaking the silence. Then one of them raised his hand, open, empty. A greeting or a warning? Lyra raised her hand in return, her face unreadable. They turned and vanished into the trees. The women returned to the cave with water and with news. Debate by the fire that night. The fire crackled loud as the people argued. Some shouted for caution. Others spoke of gifts, of sharing land and river. "It is our valley," Gray growled, his fists tight. "Our hunts, our bones in the earth. If they come, they take, they may give." Lyra answered sharply. "Shells, fish, tools. The earth is wide. We are not alone upon it." Kor sat silent for a long while, staring into the flames. Then he said, "We will not strike first, but we will be ready." The gift across the water next morning. Kor chose a few hunters to walk with him to the river. Matthew begged to go, and though Kor hesitated, he agreed. They carried no spears in hand, only slung across their backs. Instead, Kor held a bundle of gifts, a cured hide, painted with red ochre, a necklace strung with teeth of fox, a carved bone flute that sang like birds. By the riverbank they waited, Hours passed. Then the strangers came. There were 7 of them, men and women alike. Their leader was tall, his hair bound with feathers, his eyes narrow but sharp. He held his own bundle, shells, dried fish, a pouch of resin that smelled of pine. The 2 groups faced each other. River between them eased slowly. Kor stepped forward, lifted the hide, and laid it on a rock by the water. The stranger did the same with his shells. Neither crossed the river, but both nodded that it was enough. Nights of uneasy peace for many days. The tribes watched each other from afar. Sometimes they traded meat for fish, resin for ochre. Stories told in gestures and half-understood words. Matthew grew bold, waving at the children across the water. They laughed, throwing pebbles into the stream. One boy mimicked his limp, hopping on one leg and grinning. Matthew laughed back, though part of him burned with shame. Nira, too, watched the strangers. Among them was a young woman with eyes bright as fire. She carried a spear with grace, her movements strong and swift. Nira envied her confidence, admired her boldness. Yet she wondered, were they rivals or kin? The clash piece could not last. One evening, when the hunters dragged home little more than rabbits, a shout rose from the valley. Jor came running, blood on his lip, his eyes wild. They struck me, he gasped. Across the water, they took my rabbit, they mocked me. The cave roared with anger. Gray leapt up, his fists clenched. I said it. They take, they steal. Kor's jaw was stone. He ordered no strike, but the fire burned uneasy that night. 2 days later, it happened again. The people found one of their traps broken, the meat gone. Across the river, footprints marked the mud. This time, Gray did not wait for Kor. At dawn, he and 2 others crossed the river with spears raised. Shouts echoed. Women screamed. Children scattered. The strangers met them in fury. Stones flew. Spears struck. The clash was short but bloody. Gray returned with a gash across his chest, one of the others dead, his blood soaking into the sand. The strangers had lost one too, a man pierced by spear. His body floated downstream, carried by the river. The aftermath cave was filled with grief and fury. Mara wept for her son, struck down before his manhood. The women screamed at Gray, calling him fool, calling him curse. But he only sat, silent, his eyes black with shame and rage. Kor rose, his voice deep and shaking. No more. He looked at Matthew, at Nira, at every face lit by fire. This land is ours. But blood is the river's now. If they come again, we meet them with all we have. The people howled their agreement, beating spears on stone. The fire leapt high, sparks raining like stars. And outside, in the dark, across the river, other fires burned too. The valley was no longer theirs alone. The valley no longer belonged to silence, where once the cries of birds and the rush of river had been enough to fill the air. Now voices carried across the water, shouts, drums, the bark of dogs. The 2 tribes had tasted each other's strength and blood, and the world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The first strike began at dawn. Mist rolled low, pale and heavy, when a scout stumbled into the cave with blood on his arms. They came. He gasped, voice cracked. They crossed in the night. Our traps are gone. They killed the deer we caught and left the bones in the trees. A growl rose in the cave, deep and furious. Women clutched their children. Hunters seized spears. The insult was greater than hunger. It was mockery. Kor stood in the firelight, his shadow tall against the cave wall. He raised his hand, and the roar fell silent. We did not choose this, he said, voice steady. But we will answer. The march to the river people gathered. Every man and woman who could hold a weapon. Even the elders walked to the mouth of the valley, leaning on staves. The children watched wide-eyed as their fathers and mothers smeared ash across their faces, painting themselves with the black of war. Nira tied her hair tight, her sling heavy with stones. Matthew, though his leg ached, took a spear. I will not hide, he told Lyra. She wanted to forbid him, But the fire in his eyes was Oryx's fire, and she let him go. The river glimmered silver as they approached. Across the water, smoke curled above the trees. The strangers were waiting. The clash of spears, first stone flew, whizzing across the water. Then the world broke, shouts thundered. Spears arced like falling stars. Men leapt into the shallows, water splashing red. Dogs barked, snapping at legs. Kor roared, his spear shattering against a shield of hide and bone. Gray fought beside him, blood streaming down his chest, but his eyes burning. Near his stones cracked skulls, swift and sure. Matthew stumbled, but did not fall. He drove his spear into a man's thigh, teeth clenched against the scream that followed. Blood splattered across his face, hot, bitter. For the first time, he felt not boy, but man, and it terrified him. The battle raged until the sun climbed high, and then it broke. Both sides pulled back, leaving the river thick with blood, bodies floating downstream. The morning that night, the cave shook with grief. 3 hunters were dead, 2 women wounded. Marta's wail carried into the night, tearing the hearts of all who heard it. The bodies were burned on a great pyre. Ash breath consumed them, sparks rising like spirits into the dark. Elders sang low, voices rough with sorrow. Children clutched their mothers, eyes wide with terror. And yet, across the water, the enemy fires burned too. They mourned their own dead, sang their own songs. In grief, the 2 tribes were alike. The unlikely meeting days passed. No one crossed the river. The hunters kept watch, spears always ready. The women fetched water in silence, eyes darting to the trees. Children no longer played at the riverbank. Then, one evening, Matthew returned from the forest with news. I saw her, he whispered. The fire-eyed girl. Nira frowned. The stranger. He nodded. She watched me, alone. She did not throw stone or spear. She only watched. Nira felt a strange stir in her chest. Anger, jealousy, curiosity. And what did you do? Matthew shrugged. I limped on. The path of exchange. Winter crept closer, and hunger bit harder. The oryx had fled, the deer thin. The river gave little. Children cried at night, their bellies hollow. One dawn, a strange sound came from across the water. Drums, slow, steady. Then voices, not in anger, but in chant. The strangers appeared, not with spears, but with baskets. Inside lay fish, dried and salted, and roots pale as bone. Kor approached the riverbank, spear in hand. From the other side, the feather-haired leader stepped forward. He set down the baskets, then raised his empty hands. Kor hesitated. The people murmured. Then he nodded, set down a hide heavy with fat, and stepped back. The exchange was silent, tense. But it was done. For the first time since blood was spilled, hope stirred. Stories around the fire that night, as the people ate fish, Nira spoke softly. Perhaps they are not only enemies. Gray snorted. His scar darkened the firelight. They will strike again. Do not forget. But Marta, her face worn with grief, shook her head. They mourn as we mourn. Their songs are our songs. The earth has room for both. Children listen, eyes wide. For them, the idea of peace was strange, but so was endless war. The fire-eyed girl, it was not the last time Matthew saw her. One evening, as he fetched water, she stepped from the trees, alone again. She carried no spear, only a shell in her hand, white, smooth, shining. She placed it on a rock by the river and looked at him. Then she was gone. Matthew took the shell. Its surface cooled beneath his fingers. He brought it to Nira, who stared long at it, her heart heavy with thoughts she could not name. The songs of war and peace seasons turned. Some days the river ran red, other days it was a bridge of gifts. Children of both tribes watched each other from afar, half fearful, half curious. The valley no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to voices of grief, of rage, of hope. And in the cave, painted in red and black, Lyra drew both spears and blood, but also shells and hands outstretched. For the people were learning that survival was not only the hunt, Not only the fire, not only the spear. It was also the fragile thread between strangers, a thread that could strangle or bind. Winter's edge crept down from the mountains like a beast with silent paws. The valley stiffened under frost, rivers slowed, and the night stretched long as hunger itself. Two fires now burned on opposite sides of the river, and though they warmed the same air, they belonged to different worlds. But hunger makes even enemies listen. Hunger has a tongue sharper than spears. The propazala was Nira who first spoke it aloud. Why fight when the cold kills both? She whispered to Kor as they stood near the embers. Let us hunt together. One fire can warm the hands. Kor frowned, scar stark across his cheek. He had buried too many of his people to trust easily. But he also saw the ribs of the children, the hollowness in their eyes. The next morning, at the riverbank, he raised his hand across the water. The strangers came, cautious but curious. The feather-haired leader stood at the edge, his face unreadable. Kor touched his chest, then spread his hands wide. He mimed the hunt, spear raised, arm thrown, beast falling. Then he pointed to the trees, to both sides of the river, then touched his heart again. The stranger understood. His lips curled into the faintest smile. He mimed the same, spear, beast, fire. Then he struck his chest with a fist. It was agreement. The hunt of the tribe-bestie met at dawn in the forest shadow. The air was brittle, each breath clouding white. On one side stood Kor's people, lean, wary, their weapons old but steady. On the other, the feather-haired tribe, taller, with sharper spears and strange bone knives that gleamed pale. For a long while, they only looked at each other, silence thick as snow. Then the hunt began. Tracks of deer wound through the frost. Together, they stalked, silent shadows merging in the trees. Nira walked beside the fire-eyed girl, neither speaking, but each watching the other's movements. Jor matched steps with a boy of the strangers, both trying to outpace the other in silence. At last, the herd burst from the trees, great deer, antlers wide as branches. Spears flew, stones cracked, a stag fell, pierced through, its cry echoing. Another turn, gored one of the stranger men, but Kor struck it down before it trampled more. The blood of both tribes stained the snow. Together they skinned, together they carried. And when the fire was lit, they roasted the meat side by side. Children laughed, gnawing bones together. Elders exchanged words in broken sounds and gestures, pointing at stars, at rivers, at scars on their bodies. Women traded herbs, showing which soothed fever, which eased pain. The valley breathed differently that night. The bond of marriage peace born of meat is fragile. To bind it tighter, some spoke of another bond. They bring fish, Marta whispered. They bring roots. But what keeps them from leaving when the hunger is done? Blood must bind blood. The idea spread like flame. A woman of one tribe could join the other, and their children would be both. Not enemy, not stranger. Kor hesitated, but the feather-haired leader, too, seemed to understand. He touched the shoulder of the fire-eyed girl, then looked across the flames at Nira. The air stilled. Nira's heart thudded. She remembered battles, stones flying, blood on her sling. She remembered laughter of children, the shell Matthew had carried, the nights of hunger. She nodded. Not at once, not with joy, but with the weight of survival. The girl crossed the fire. She placed a shell in Nira's hand, and Nira gave her a painted stone. Their fingers brushed, and the tribes howled approval, their cries rising into the night. Tension in the shadows knit. All were pleased. Gray muttered in the dark, sharpening his blade. We give them daughters. Tomorrow they take our land. Others agree, fear sour in their mouths. The memory of dead sons still burned. But the bond had been made, and to break it meant more war. For now, suspicion slept with open eyes. The shared fire through the heart of winter. They gathered at one fire in the valley's center. It roared high, fed by both tribes. Meat roasted on shared spits. Children darted through smoke, their laughter ringing louder than the crack of flames. Matthew sat with the strangers, listening to their words. He caught fragments, names of stars, words for rivers, songs of hunts. He taught them his own, pointing at his leg, laughing when they mimicked his limp with smiles instead of mockery. Elders traded stories. Oric was gone, but his words lived in Matthew, who repeated them with new hands gesturing. The stranger elders nodded, their own tales flowing in return. Lyra painted the fire itself on the cave wall, a circle of red, with figures of both tribes gathered around it for the first time. The wall showed not only beasts and blood, but people hand in hand. A thread from the woodsy at peace is always a fragile skin stretched over hunger. One night, as the fire burned low, the dogs barked. Shapes moved in the trees, not deer, not wolves. Strange men, leaner, hungrier, their eyes like fireflies in the dark. A third tribe, unknown, drawn by smoke and smell. The valley was no longer a place of two fires. It was a place of many. The nights in the valley grew heavier, and even the air seemed to carry whispers of tension. Though the two fires of the joined tribes now burned together at the center of the valley, shadows stretched longer, and everyone felt it. The world was no longer only theirs. The third people had come from the woods, lean figures with eyes glowing like embers in the dark. They had not yet spoken, not yet attacked, but their presence was like a storm gathering at the edge of the sky. The dogs barked at every rustle. The hunters clutched their spears even when they slept, and mothers kept their children close, whispering old prayers to the stars. At first, some thought they might be like the strangers by the river, dangerous at first, but willing to share. But others remembered the bones hung from trees, the mocking of enemies, the smell of blood that never quite faded from memory. Gray's voice was loudest, low and bitter, reminding all that too much trust had already cost lives. Yet even he sharpened his blades with a look not of defiance, but of fear. For these new shapes in the forest were many, and their hunger was deeper than the cold. One evening, as the shared fire burned high, Matthew limped to the edge of the trees. He had always been restless, unable to accept only what was given, always searching for more. His eyes caught movement, and slowly, carefully, he pushed aside the branches. There, beyond the trunks, he saw them, the third people. They were thinner than both tribes of the valley, their skin stretched tight over ribs, their eyes hollow yet burning. They carried no fire, no hides, only crude spears and sharp stones. Their leader was gaunt, his hair wild, his face painted with ash. He watched Matthew with the stillness of a wolf before the leap. Matthew stepped back, his heart hammering, and for a long moment the two only looked at each other. Then the stranger bared his teeth, not in a smile but in hunger, and slipped back into the dark. Matthew told the others what he had seen, and the fire that night burned longer, higher, as if the flames themselves could keep shadows away. The elders muttered that the valley was cursed, that too many eyes now sought its shelter, its river, its herds. The core, grim and steady, said only, "The earth does not curse. The earth tests." The testing came sooner than they hoped. On a morning when frost still clung to the grass, the hunters found one of their traps broken. The deer it had caught was gone, and in the mud lay prints, smaller, lighter, not of their allies and not of their own. The third people had taken it. The camp erupted in anger, voices shouting, fists raised. And yet beneath it all there was a gnawing fear. Meat stolen was more than food lost. It was a message. Hunger was coming, and hunger makes men savage. That night, the feather-haired leader of the allied tribe crossed the firelight and spoke to Kor. The two did not share a tongue, but with gestures, with broken words, with drawings in ash, they spoke enough. They could not let the third people take the valley. They must hunt together, guard together, fight together if it came to that. For the first time, men of the tribes clasped arms not just for meat, but for blood, for survival against a greater enemy. Days bled into nights, and the valley changed. Scouts patrolled in pairs, one from each tribe, their steps uneven, but their eyes sharp. Women worked side by side, sharing roots, braiding sinew cords. teaching each other the names of herbs. Children, who once had thrown stones across the river in mockery, now laughed together, though even their laughter was quick to silence at the snap of a branch in the woods. Still, the third people crept closer. Their fires were seen at the edges of the forest, low, faint, but many. Once, Jor swore he heard them chanting in the night, voices high and shrill, like birds crying in the dark. No one slept easily after that. Then, at last, the storm broke. At dawn, when the mist was thick and the hunters prepared for deer, screams tore through the valley. The third people came in a wave, their bodies painted black, their spears jagged. They poured from the trees, howling, striking not only at men, but at women and children. The fire-eyed girl fought with fury, her spear flashing like lightning. Nearest struck stones with deadly calm, shattering skulls. Her arm unshaken even as blood splattered across her face. Matthew, limping, thrust his spear into the gut of a man who came too close. The weight of survival heavier than his fear. The clash was chaos. Dogs tore at throats, the air filled with the sound of bone breaking, of screams and roaring fire. Kor fought like a storm himself, his scarred face grim, his spear unrelenting. Gray, though old and bitter, swung his axe with strength born of rage, his curses loud even over the din. The feather-haired leader bellowed, rallying his people, striking blow after blow. Hours stretched like years. The ground grew slick with blood, bodies lay broken. At last, the third people faltered. Their hunger had driven them, but their strength failed. They fled into the trees, leaving their dead behind. The valley shook with the echo of their screams fading into the distance. When silence came, it was heavier than any roar. The two tribes stood together, panting, trembling, their bodies streaked with red, their eyes hollow. They had survived, but at cost. 3 more of their own lay dead, and the fire itself seemed weary, its flames drooping low as if exhausted by the carnage. But in that silence, something else was born. Bonds sealed not by words, not by gifts, but by blood spilled side by side. Children clung not only to their mothers but to women of the other tribe. Men clasped shoulders of those they once distrusted. Women tended wounds of strangers as though they were brothers. The valley was no longer a place of one people or two. It had become something else. A place of many bloodlines, many fires, bound together by the cruel hand of survival. Yet still, in the dark beyond the trees, eyes watched. Hunger had not ended. The test was not over. When the echoes of battle had at last faded, the valley lay heavy with silence. Smoke still rose from smoldering torches, and the ground was scarred where blood had soaked too deep to wash away. The people of both tribes gathered in the clearing, faces hollow with exhaustion, yet touched with something new, the realization that they had survived together. For the first time, the fire burned not for one tribe nor for the other, but for both. Yet even in that shared glow, shadows crept. Shadows not from the trees but from within men's hearts. The first days after the clash were strange. Hunters who once would never have spoken now shared meat by the fire, offering each other marrow bones and liver, the choicest parts. Women braided sinew cords together, stitching hides not for their own kin alone, but for those who had fought beside them. Children mimicked their elders, playing at battles with sticks, their cries echoing the ferocity of the real fight, though their laughter softened its memory. For a moment, hope stirred that the valley could become a place not of division, but of one people forged in blood and trial. But peace is always fragile. Hunger still gnawed, winter still lingered, and memory of the dead weighed heavier than gratitude for the living. Some whispered that the other tribe had not fought hard enough, that they had held back, letting their allies bleed more. Others muttered that too much food had been shared, that strangers were eating the marrow of their children's survival. The murmurs grew, quiet at first, but louder as days passed. The fire that had united them now cast light on weary faces dyed it was gray, scarred, and bitter. Who first gave voice to the doubts? He stood by the fire, axe across his shoulder, his eyes narrow. We bleed, he growled. We bury, and still they take. Their bellies are not ours. Their blood is not ours. When the cold deepens, when the deer vanish, will they not turn on us as the others did? His words spread like sparks, catching in dry hearts. Some nodded, some scowled, but all felt the weight of what he said. Yet across the fire, the feather-haired leader rose. His voice was harsh, broken by the barrier of language, but his meaning was clear. He pointed to the ground, to the blood that still stained it, then to the fire. He lifted his spear and drove it into the earth between them, a gesture of bond, of oath. Together, he said in his rough tongue, or none. The valley listened, and for a breath, the tension eased still, suspicion lingered. When a child of one tribe fell sick, whispers blamed the other. When a deer was caught, arguments flared over whose spear had struck first. The women tried to soothe, the children still laughed together. But among the men, pride was a fire harder to quench than hunger. Matthew watched all this with troubled eyes. He had seen the face of the third people's leader, had felt the hunger in that gaze, and he knew they had not vanished for good. To divide now would mean death. Yet he could not silence great nor still the restless stirrings of mistrust. In his dreams, he saw the valley torn not by outsiders but by its own children, the fire at its heart turning from warmth to ruin. One night, when the moon was thin and cold, a dispute broke into violence. A man of Korah's tribe and a hunter of the feather-haired leaders clashed over a strip of dried meat. Shouts turned to blows, blows to blood, and before the elders could part them, one lay gasping on the ground, his ribs broken. Silence fell heavier than the frost. The wound was not just in flesh, but in the fragile bond that had held them. Gore stepped forward then, grim as stone. He looked from his people to the others, his scarred face unreadable. "This valley is not a gift," he said slowly. "It is a weight. We carry it together, or it crushes us apart." He ordered the meat divided again, evenly, and made both men's families share the same hut until the injured one healed. Some called it wisdom, others folly, but none could deny that without such commands, the fire might have split the night. Still, the test deepened. As winter pressed harder, food grew scarce. The forest seemed emptier, the traps yielded little, and the river ran cold and thin. Children cried at night, their bellies hollow, and old ones wasted away by the fire. Whispers returned, sharper than before. Perhaps it was better if the valley was theirs alone. Perhaps strangers should return to the forest where they belonged. But even as envy grew, so too did bonds in unexpected places. A young woman of Korah's people, Lyra, was seen laughing with a hunter from the feather-haired tribe. They shared not only words, but glances, gestures, a closeness that others noticed. Some frowned, some spat, but others wondered if such ties might be the only way to truly bind the peoples as one. The fire burned on, but its light flickered with uncertainty. The valley had survived the storm of enemies, yet now it faced a subtler storm. One born not of hunger alone, but of the hearts of men. The frost deepened, and nights stretched longer than memory could hold. Each dawn felt fragile, as if the sun itself struggled to rise over a world heavy with hunger and suspicion. Yet amid the cold and uncertainty, a spark of something unexpected flickered, a bond between Lyra, daughter of Korah's people, and a hunter of the feather-haired tribe whose name was Reagan. It began with laughter near the fire, a sharing of roots boiled in a clay pot, and eyes that lingered longer than custom allowed. At first, people dismissed it as foolishness, a distraction from the harshness of survival. But as days passed, it became something more. They were seen walking together to the river, their shadows merging in the morning mist. Reagan would teach her the names as people gave to fish and stones, and she in turn showed him how her tribe shaped clay into bowls that did not crack in frost. They found ways to speak with hands, with gestures, with touches that bridged the gap of tongues. In their closeness, there was no hunger, no cold, only the warmth of a new fire. But the valley was not blind. Whispers rose quickly, sharper than the wind. Some of Kor's people muttered that Lyra betrayed her blood, that she offered strength to strangers who might one day take more than her heart. From the feather-haired tribe, some sneered that Regan wasted himself on a woman who was not his own, that such mixing would bring weakness. Children giggled, imitating them, while elders frowned, their silence heavier than words. Kor himself said little. His scarred face remained unreadable, but in his eyes burned a storm. He loved his daughter, yet he carried the weight of his people. To allow such a bond could mean peace deeper than any oath, but it could also mean division sharper than any spear. He watched, he waited, his silence more terrifying to Lyra than shouts would have been. The tension came to a head when a child fell ill, a boy from Kor's tribe. His cough rattled his chest, and fever consumed him. His mother wept, crying that it was the fault of strangers, that their presence had cursed the valley. In grief and fear, she pointed to Lyra and Regan, saying their union had angered the spirits. Others picked up the cry, voices rising in anger and superstition. Stones were lifted, hands reached for spears. Regan stepped forward then, his eyes fierce, his voice cutting through the clamor. Though his words were broken in the other tongue, his meaning was clear. He swore that no spirit was angered, no curse brought. He tore open his own palm with a flint and let the blood fall into the fire. If spirits hunger, he shouted, let them take me. The flames hissed, sparks leapt, and for a moment all stood silent, staring at the red drops burning in the embers. The boy's fever did not break the night, but it did break to nights later, when the herbs of the allied women soothed his breath, and his eyes opened once more. Whispers turned then, not of curses, but of healing, of shared care. Still, suspicion clung like frost on bark, yet even as distrust simmered, something else began to grow. Lyra and Regan's bond became a story whispered in the dark, a story children repeated, a story that softened hearts even while others hardened. It was not just about them. It was about the possibility that the fires could become one. Winter dragged on, cruel and long. Meat grew scarce, bellies hollow. But when Regan and Lyra one day returned from the forest carrying a deer between them, a deer no trap nor lone hunter had caught, but which they had brought down together, the camp erupted not in anger, but in awe. The beast was heavy, its flesh enough to fill many mouths. For the first time in many moons, the fire crackled with the smell of abundance, and children ate until their faces shone with grease. It was a gift greater than any words. Some still muttered, some still frowned, but none could deny that from their union had come life, not ruin. The valley breathed easier than night, though hunger still stalked its edges. But shadows lingered. Gray, bitter, and unyielding, saw in Lyra and Regan not hope but danger. He watched them with eyes like flint, muttering that one day their love would tear the valley apart. And in the darkness beyond the fire, unseen eyes still glowed. The third people might have been driven back, but hunger never sleeps. When at last the grip of winter loosened, the valley seemed to breathe again. Snow melted into rivulets that ran down the slopes. The river swelled, its surface flashing with light, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and green shoots. For the first time in many moons, color returned to the world. Children splashed in puddles, laughing at the cold water, and women stretched hides in the sunlight, marveling at how warmth touched their skin once more. Hunters walked with lighter steps, no longer burdened by the silence of empty traps. Yet with spring came not only life but also change, and change is never gentle. The thaw revealed what the snow had hidden. Bones of the third people lay scattered at the forest edge, gnawed by wolves and crows. A grim reminder that their hunger had not been banished, only silenced. The bodies of allies, too, buried shallow in frozen ground, surfaced as the frost retreated, and families wept anew, their grief fresh and like wounds torn open again. The valley was no longer simply a home. It had become a grave as well. But the earth was generous. Green shoots sprouted by the riverbank, and fish swam thick beneath the swollen waters. Deer returned, lean from the long cold but alive, and their tracks brought hope. Hunters from both tribes set out together, their spears steady, their eyes keen. They no longer mocked each other's gait or words, but moved with the rhythm of those who had bled side by side. For a time, it seemed the valley might become what the fire promised, a place of abundance, of unity. Lyra and Reagan thrived in this season. They ranged deep into the forest, bringing back roots, berries, and once even a boar. Its tusks sharp, its flesh enough to feed both camps. Their bond was no longer just whispered in corners, but spoken openly, some with blessing, some with resentment, but all with acknowledgement. Even Kor, though his face remained hard, allowed her to sit by Reagan at the fire. For the first time since the storm of blood, laughter returned, fragile but real. Yet spring also stirred old wounds. With food came strength, and with strength came pride. Gray, bitter as ever, found his voice once more. He walked among his people, pointing to the swelling bellies of the feather-haired tribe, to their laughter, to the ease with which they now moved through the valley. See how they spread, he growled. See how their roots sink deeper into soil that is not theirs. Today they share meat, tomorrow they take land, and when our daughters lie with their sons, what remains of us? His words, like the stinging wind of early spring, bit deep. Not all agreed, but doubt is a seed that grows quickly in fertile soil. Whispers rose that the valley was large enough for one people, not two. Some muttered that perhaps the thaw was a sign not of unity, but of separation. That as the snow melted, so too should the bond. The feather-haired leader felt this shift, though he spoke little. He watched with wary eyes, his hand always near his spear, even when laughter filled the air. He had seen too many bonds break in his life, too many promises turn to ash. And though he respected Kor, he knew that respect could not silence envy forever. Tension returned not as a storm, but as a drizzle, slow, persistent, soaking into every word and glance. A hunter's jest was heard as insult. A shared meal was weighed for fairness too closely. When a child from Kor's tribe drowned in the swollen river, grief turned to blame. Fingers pointed at the feather-haired tribe, accusing them of luring the child away. Rage boiled, and though the elders calmed it, the scar remained. Matthew, still limping but alive, walked off in between the camps, speaking to both, urging calm. He told them of the third people, of the eyes he had seen in the dark, reminding them that danger had not vanished, but men are quicker to fight those they know than those hidden in shadows. And his words, though true, often fell like stones into water, vanishing beneath ripples of anger. One night, as frogs croaked by the river and fireflies danced above the grass, Lyra and Reagan stood apart from the others. They looked to the stars, their hands clasped, their faces heavy with the knowledge that their bond carried not only love but weight. If we leave, Lyra whispered, they will call us traitors. If we stay, they will call us thieves. Reagan kissed her hand, his eyes burning. Then we must become something else, he said. Not theirs, not ours, but new. It was a dream fragile as spring flowers, beautiful, but easily crushed. As spring deepened, the valley transformed into something almost unrecognizable after the long months of frost. The air was filled with birdsong, the forest hummed with life, and the river roared with the strength of melted snow. Wildflowers bloomed in fields that had been barren, splashing color across the land as though the earth itself tried to heal its scars. Children ran barefoot through the grass, no longer confined to smoky huts, and laughter rang once more in the valley. Yet even amid renewal, old fears lingered like shadows at noon. The hunters discovered caves high in the cliffs when following the paths of mountain goats. Inside, the walls bore markings, carvings of animals, spirals, and crude shapes of men and beasts locked in struggle. Some believed the markings were left by ancestors, warnings from those who had lived and died before. Others whispered they were the signs of spirits, perhaps the very ones who had tested them with hunger and blood. Kor touched the stone with his scarred hand and said nothing, but his silence carried weight, as if the past itself had laid a hand upon him. Lyra and Regan climbed to the caves too, their curiosity greater than fear. They traced the carvings with their fingers, marveling at the stories etched in stone. Regan laughed softly, telling her with gestures that even if men quarreled and tribes divided, their hands had always left marks on the earth, proof they once lived. Lyra pressed her palm against the stone beside his, leaving the faint print of mud and ash, as though to say, "We are here too." But not all discoveries were so gentle. One day, a band of hunters followed tracks deep into the woods and found signs of the third people. Not their bodies, but their tools, newly sharpened, hidden beneath leaves. The enemy was not gone. They were watching, waiting, gathering strength like wolves beyond the light of the fire. Fear spread again through the camp, a reminder that survival was never secure. No matter how warm the sun or plentiful the water, Gray seized upon this. He walked among his people, lifting the crude blade they had found. "They wait," he said, his voice carrying across the camp. "They hunger still, and when they return, will strangers fight as fiercely for your children as you would, or will they run back to their own?" His words stirred doubt once more, sowing unease just as flowers sowed seeds in the wind. Yet life pressed forward. The women of both tribes began to plant small gardens along the riverbanks, pressing seeds into damp soil. It was an idea brought by the feather-haired tribe, who had once lived further south where the earth was kinder. Kor's people watched with suspicion at first, scoffing that no seed could grow quickly enough to fill empty bellies. But weeks later, green shoots rose, tender leaves trembling in the breeze, and hope sprouted with them. It was the first time many had seen food rise not from the forest or the hunt, but from their own hands shaping the earth. Children tended the gardens eagerly, splashing water from the river, laughing when mud stained their legs. Elders, too weak to hunt, sat nearby and hummed old songs, watching life rise from soil. Slowly, grudgingly, the two tribes found themselves working side by side, bound not by battle, but by the fragile miracle of growth. Still, tension smoldered. When the first shoots were pulled too soon by eager hands, arguments flared over who had the right to the tender green stems. When fish grew scarce in the river, accusations flew of nets set in secret, of greed in the night. The bond was always tested, stretched thin, but never quite broken. Amid it all, Lyra and Regan's love deepened. Some now saw them not as traitors but as a bridge, proof that the peoples could live not only side by side but as one. When Lyra's belly began to swell, whispers turned to awe. A child born of both tribes, a child of fire and feather, of scar and song. To some, it was hope. To others, it was a threat. And as the valley bloomed with spring, the unborn child became a symbol. Some prayed it would heal the rift, binding the tribes into a single people. Others whispered it would be the spark that tore them apart as spring ripened into summer. The valley seemed to them with life. The river grew calmer after its roaring floods, its waters now clear, filled with darting fish that sparkled like silver blades beneath the sun. Grass rose high, bending in waves as the wind passed, and the forests were thick with the calls of birds and the rustling of deer through undergrowth. Children raced through fields, their voices bright, their limbs thin but strong after months of hunger. Women wove baskets and stretched hides to dry in the golden warmth, their laughter mingling with the hum of insects. It seemed, for a brief span of weeks, that the valley itself had forgiven the blood spilled on its soil. But even as the land healed, the people did not. The bond between Lyra and Regan grew more visible as her belly swelled, and with it, so did the weight of expectation. For some, her child was a miracle, proof that the peoples could become one, bound not only by fire and war, but by flesh and blood. For others, it was a sign of weakness, a mingling that blurred lines that had kept tribes apart for generations. Around the fire, voices clashed. Some blessed the unborn with prayers to the sky and the earth. Others spat into the flames, whispering that the spirits would not recognize a child of divided blood. Gray's bitterness only sharpened with the turning of the season. He had not forgotten the hunger, nor forgiven the strangers for sharing their fire. To him, every laugh between the two tribes was a crack in the stone of his people. Every shared hunt a theft of pride. He spoke in low tones to those who would listen, his words like coals fanned into flame. When that child is born, he hissed, will it be ours or theirs? And when it grows, will it not take what belongs to us all? His words fell heavy on ears already weighed by doubt, and though not all agreed, unease rippled through the camp like wind through tall grass. Yet not all was suspicion. For many, hope blossomed in the promise of the child. Women from both tribes came to Lyra, offering herbs to ease her sickness, weaving charms to guard her from evil spirits. Children gathered near her, fascinated by the swell of her belly, asking if the baby would speak with two tongues or laugh louder than others. Even Kor, whose face remained stern, was seen watching her by the fire, his eyes softening when she smiled. He said little, but his silence was no longer that of storm. It was the silence of a man who carried both fear and fragile hope. The day of birth came with a storm. The sky turned black, thunder rolled through the valley, and rain lashed against the huts. Inside, the women worked in frantic harmony, their voices chanting, their hands steady. Reagan waited outside, his face pale, his body trembling as lightning split the sky. When at last the child's cry broke through the storm, it was like the valley itself exhaled. A daughter, small and fierce, her lungs stronger than the thunder, her eyes dark and unblinking. The storm passed quickly, leaving the world washed clean. And when Reagan held the child for the first time, the camp gathered to see. Some gasped, others wept, and many fell silent. The baby's skin bore the tones of both tribes, neither one nor the other, but something new. To some, she was the future. To others, she was the beginning of the end. They named her Kelra, a name that blended sounds from both tongues, chosen by Lyra and Reagan together. The fire burned high that night. Meat was shared, songs rose, some of joy, some of mourning. For one night, the valley was whole, but peace never lingers long. Days later, when the hunters returned empty-handed and the fish in the river thinned, whispers turned once more. Some said the child was blessed, others cursed. A deer stumbled near the camp and died without wound, its body thin and sickly, and elders muttered that it was an omen. Gray's voice rose again, harsh and venomous, calling Kelra a mark of weakness, a spirit born to divide. Reagan confronted him then, fury burning in his eyes. The two men stood at the edge of the firelight, one young and strong, the other scarred and unyielding. Words turned to shouts, shouts to blows, and before others could separate them, blood was spilled, not of strangers, but of men who should have been brothers. The fire crackled, sparks leaping into the night, as if the valley itself watched. Holding its breath, the people pulled them apart. But the damage was done. The child who had been born in the storm now lived under one as well, a storm of men's hearts, where love and hate clashed louder than thunder. And in the distance, beyond the safety of the fire, eyes glowed once more in the dark. Seasons passed slowly in the valley, each day both a gift and a trial. Kelra grew beneath the watchful eyes of the tribes, her cries and laughter mingling with the wind that swept across the fields. At first she was no more than a fragile bundle, swaddled in hides and carried between her mother and father. But even in her earliest days she carried weight greater than her small body. To some, every breath she drew was hope itself, proof that the valley might yet be home to one people. To others, every breath was a reminder of their fear that old ways would vanish, that blood would be diluted, that the voices of the ancestors would grow faint. Yet Kelra was a child, and children do not know fear. She laughed when the dogs barked, reached out her hands toward the sparks of the fire, and pulled the hair of children who came too close. She grew quickly, her legs sturdy, her eyes sharp. Her first steps were not only celebrated by her parents, but by women from both camps, who clapped their hands and sang. The firelight danced across her face, and for a moment even Gray fell silent. Though his eyes burned with thoughts unspoken, life in the valley followed its rhythm. The hunts grew plentiful through summer. The gardens by the river bore fruit, and for a time, hunger loosened its grip. With food came strength, and with strength came gatherings. Men competed in feats of skill, throwing spears at targets of bark, racing barefoot through the fields. Women wove intricate mats of reeds and sang songs in both tongues, their voices weaving together like the threads of the mats themselves. Children played games of chase, some imitating court with a makeshift scar across their faces, others pretending to be the feather-haired leader, shouting commands in broken mimicry. For fleeting weeks, the valley seemed less a place of survival and more a place of living. But peace is always fragile. The more the tribes mingled, the more questions rose. Who would lead them when danger came again? Would it be Kor, scarred and seasoned, or the feather-haired chief, proud and cunning? Some whispered that perhaps it should be neither. But someone knew, someone born of both. They looked to Kelra with thoughts too heavy for a child, whispering futures that she could not yet carry. Kor saw the whispers. He heard the way people spoke of his granddaughter, though she had not yet spoken her first words. He remained silent, his face unreadable, but inside he wrestled with storms. He had fought too long to keep his people alive, to surrender them to dreams. Yet when Kelra crawled into his lap, her tiny fingers tracing the scars on his face, he felt something he could not name, a tenderness sharper than grief, and a fear greater than death. The feather-haired leader to watch the child with care. He spoke little, but his men noticed how his eyes softened when Kelra toddled across the grass. How he gave her trinkets, a feather, a bead, a polished stone, small gifts that seemed to carry more meaning than food or weapons. His people murmured that perhaps the spirits had chosen her, that she was the bond between fire and feather, between stone and song. But Gray did not soften. He grew harder with each passing moon, his voice louder, his words sharper. He gathered those who shared his doubts, hunters who resented sharing their kills, mothers who feared their children would grow without the old songs, young men who longed for glory, unchained by compromise. Around small fires, away from the central flame, he whispered of betrayal, of weakness, of the danger of forgetting who they were. And slowly, a small group began to follow him, their eyes dark with resolve. The valley, though lush and green, was divided. By day, laughter and work continued. Gardens grew, hides dried, hunts returned with game. By night, shadows deepened. Arguments broke out over nothing. A fish too small, a glance held too long, a word misunderstood between tongues. What had once been a miracle of survival now trembled on the edge of fractured dot. And always, beyond the trees, the eye still watched. The third people had not returned in force, but their signs remain. Bones stripped clean left near the river, strange markings on trees, the distant echo of cries in the night. Some said they had scattered, broken by defeat. Others believed they had only grown hungrier, waiting for the valley to weaken itself. It was during this uneasy peace that Kelra first spoke. Her voice was small but clear, and the words she uttered was not in one tongue nor the other, but a sound that seemed to bridge both. Children cheered, women laughed, and men fell silent. For a moment, it seemed the valley itself held its breath, listening to this new voice. Some smiled with wonder, others frowned, unsettled. For in her first word, they heard something they could not control, the birth of something new. Kelra's first words became a story that spread through the valley like wildfire. Every hut, every circle of hunters, every group of women by the river repeated it, savoring its sound as though it were a sign. Some believed she had created a new tongue, a sacred language that bound two worlds together. Others said it was nonsense, a meaningless babble. But even they spoke of it, unable to ignore how the moment had settled into the bones of the people. The child was no longer just a child. She was a symbol, and symbols are heavier than any stone dot. As months passed, Kelra grew, her steps steady, her laughter echoing against the cliffs. She ran with the other children, fearless, tumbling in the grass and splashing in the river. Yet wherever she went, eyes followed. Mothers whispered blessings, old men muttered curses, and hunters debated whether to guard her or to guard against her. She was too young to understand the weight pressing upon her, but she felt it nonetheless in the way hands lingered on her hair, in the way silences deepened when she entered a circle. The tribes themselves began to mirror her presence. Some gatherings brimmed with laughter and unity, hunts shared, songs woven from the traditions, feasts where meat and roots were divided without quarrel. But beneath the joy, there was always the shadow of division. Arguments rose like sudden storms. Whose tongue should be used for prayers? Which spirits should receive offerings at the great fire? Who had the right to decide where the people would move when the herds migrated? Each question cracked the fragile peace, and every crack widened when Gray poured his venom into waiting ears. One evening, the fire blazed high, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Gray stood before the gathered people, his voice raw and strong. "You call this peace," he shouted, "but it is a chain around our necks. We share our food until our bellies grow empty. We mix our blood until our ancestors turn away. And all for what? For a child who does not yet know her own name." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, anger flashing in their eyes. Others turned away, unwilling to break what little unity remained. Reagan rose to answer him. His voice was calmer, but no less fierce. "You speak of chains, Gray, but what chained us more than hunger? What chained us more than fear? When we cowered in caves while storms tore the sky apart. We are alive now, not because we stood apart, but because we stood together. And this child, my daughter, is not weakness. She is proof that the valley itself chose us to remain." The crowd roared with voices on both sides. Some raised fists in support of Reagan, others snarled their agreement with Gray. Sparks from the fire spiraled upward, as though the flames themselves fed on the division. Kor, sitting apart, said nothing. His eyes burned into the fire, his scarred face unreadable, while the feather-haired leader stood at the edge of the circle, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, watching, weighing. The following days were tense. Hunting parties returned with fewer kills, for men who once worked together now competed, each trying to prove the strength of his own tribe. Children who once played freely now quarreled, repeating words they had heard from their parents. Small voices carrying heavy hatred. Lyra wept in silence, clutching Kelra to her chest, fearing for the future she had hoped to give her daughter. And then the signs of the third people grew stronger. Tracks appeared near the river, footprints too small for deer, too broad for wolves. A crude symbol was carved into a tree. A twisted marred none could read, but all feared. At night, distant drums echoed through the forest, a sound that made even the bravest hunters shiver. Whispers spread that the third people had not only returned, but grown stronger, watching and waiting for the valley to collapse upon itself. One night, Kelra woke crying. She pointed toward the shadows beyond the fire, babbling words her parents could not understand. Reagan held her close, scanning the darkness, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement. A flicker between the trees, eyes catching the firelight before vanishing. He gripped his spear tighter, his heart pounding with a terror he could not shake. The elders gathered the next morning. Voices clashed. Some called for uniting once more, for setting aside their quarrels to face the greater threat. Others claimed it was too late. The trust had already been broken. Kor finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the noise. "You fight like dogs over bones while wolves circle our camp. If you cannot stand as one, you will not stand at all." His words silenced the crowd, but silence was not agreement. It was the silence of men who feared both paths, unity and division alike. Kelra, unaware of the storm around her, played in the dirt, tracing shapes with a stick. Some said the shapes looked like symbols, marks of power, signs of destiny. Others dismissed them as meaningless. But even those who doubted could not stop themselves from watching her. As though in her small hands the future of the valley already rested, the drums came closer. At first, They were only whispers in the night, faint thuds that could be dismissed as echoes of storms or the hollow sound of wood cracking in the wind. But soon they grew stronger, a steady beat that made the earth itself seem to pulse beneath the people's feet. Children awoke weeping, dogs howled into the darkness, and even the bravest hunters shifted uneasily at the sound. The third people were no longer shadows. They were near. One evening, a scout returned to camp breathless, his face pale with terror. He had seen them, he claimed, dozens of figures moving silently through the forest, their bodies painted with ash, their hair matted with bone charms. They carried no torches, no fire, yet their eyes glowed in the gloom like wild animals. He swore he had followed them for hours, but they made no sound, no broken twig, no rustle of leaves. It was as though the forest itself carried them. His words chilled the camp to silence, for no one doubted the truth of his fear. Kor summoned the leaders to the fire. The feather-haired chief stood at his side, Reagan close by, Lyra clutching Kelra in the shadows. Greta came, his arms crossed, his mouth twisted in disdain. The fire roared, sparks flying high, while outside the circle the drums continued, steady, relentless. They test us, Kor said, his voice slow but firm. They circle like wolves, waiting for weakness. They will not wait long. Gray spat into the flames. Weakness. We are weak already. We bleed ourselves for a child. We waste our food on strangers. If they attack, it will be because we invited them. Perhaps the spirits send them to cleanse what has been poisoned. Reagan's hand flew to his spear, but the feather-haired leader raised his arm to still him, his eyes fixed on Gray, sharp as flint. Poison does not grow children, he said. Poison does not bring laughter. That child is life. But you, his voice dropped to a hiss. You would rather feed the valley to death than see her live. The circle erupted into shouting. Some sided with Gray, others with Reagan. The fires seemed to swell with their rage, the drums outside growing louder, as if answering their fury. Kelra whimpered, and Lyra pulled her close, her heart breaking as she watched the people fracture further. That night, the attack came. It began with silence. The drums stopped, the forest held its breath. Then the shadows moved. Figures surged from the trees, swift and terrible, their bodies glinting with bone and stone weapons. Their cries split the night, not words but shrieks, high and piercing, meant to unmake courage before blood was even spilled. The camp erupted. Spears clashed with clubs, arrows hissed through the air, fire spilled as torches fell. Men fought like cornered beasts, women defended their children with knives and stones. The third people were fast, their strikes cruel, but they did not expect such fury from those they thought divided. Reagan fought at the front, his arms stained with blood, his voice a roar that rallied the faltering. The feather-haired leader moved like a hawk, his blade flashing, cutting down foes with ruthless precision. Even Kor, old and scarred, rose with his axe, his body trembling, but his strike steady. But Gray was gone. While the people fought, he vanished into the night, his shadow slipping toward the forest. Some saw him flee and cursed his name, but others wondered if he ran to save his own skin or to betray them altogether. Kelra cried in Lyra's arms, the sound piercing the chaos. A warrior of the third people lunged toward them, bone spear raised. But before it could strike, Kor threw himself between. The spear pierced his shoulder, yet he held fast, swinging his axe with a roar that shattered the night. The attacker fell, lifeless, and Kor staggered, but did not yield. The battle raged until dawn. Blood soaked the earth, screams filled the air, and smoke rose where fires had spread. Yet when the sun broke over the cliffs, the third people retreated, vanishing into the trees as suddenly as they had come. The camp was left broken, but not destroyed. Bodies lay still, but so did the bodies of their enemies. Against all odds, the valley had held. When the survivors gathered, their faces bloodied and hollow. Silence fell. They looked to Kor, who leaned on his axe, his wound seeping but his eyes fierce. He raised his voice, hoarse but unyielding. "You see now," he said, "what waits when we fight each other. They will come again, stronger, hungrier. And if we are not one, we will be nothing." The child, he turned, his gaze falling on Kelra and Lyra's arms. "She is not curse nor blessing. She is only a chance, our last chance. Decide now if you will take it or throw it away." No one spoke. The valley was hushed, as though the earth itself waited for their answer. The days after the battle were heavy with silence. Smoke drifted above the valley for many dawns, curling into the sky like the breath of the dead. The huts were blackened, their roofs patched with haste, and the smell of blood lingered in the earth. Women scrubbed hides stained with red, men buried their kin in shallow graves, and children walked as if in a dream, their laughter swallowed by grief. The valley, once alive with songs and hunts, seemed muted, as though it to mourn. Yet even in grief, life pressed forward. Fires were lit again, meat was cooked, tools repaired. The river still flowed, the sun still rose, and hunger still demanded its due. People worked side by side, but tension hung in every glance. Words were whispered more than spoken, and the name on every tone was Gray's. Some cursed him for his cowardice, swearing he had doomed them all. Others claimed he was wise to vanish, that perhaps he carried some hidden purpose. A few even wondered if he had guided the third people to the camp, leading them with betrayal as his weapon. Reagan searched for him at first, rage burning hot in his chest. He followed trails into the forest, scouring for footprints, broken branches, any sign of the man. But the woods gave up no secrets. Gray was gone, swallowed by the wilderness, his fate a mystery that gnawed at every heart. At the central fire, Kor called the people together. His wound had been bound with strips of hide, his body weaker but his voice strong. "We lived because we stood together," he said, "and yet, even as we bled, one of us fled. Decide now, will his name be spoken again, or will it be struck from memory like a stone cast into the river?" The people murmured, torn. Some cried out to curse him, to erase his place forever. Others shifted uneasily, unwilling to sever ties so completely, fearing the spirit's wrath if kin were forgotten. In the end, silence won. Gray's name was not erased, but neither was it honored. It hung in the air like smoke, heavy, choking, inescapable. Kelra, too young to know the weight of names, toddled through the circle. Her hands clutching a stick she dragged across the dirt. She drew lines and spirals, laughing at shapes only she understood. The elders watched her, their faces unreadable. Some muttered that she marked omens. Others scoffed, saying she was only a child. Yet no one could take their eyes from her, as if her small gestures carried more than innocence. Lyra clung to her daughter more tightly after the attack. She dreamed of fire, of shadows, of screams, and woke with Kaelra's warmth against her chest as the only anchor. Reagan to bore the scars, though he spoke little. His eyes grew darker, his jaw tighter. Each day weighed with the burden of both father and protector of all. At night, he stood at the edge of the camp, spear in hand, staring into the forest as though willing Gray to appear, or the third people to return. The feather-haired leader grew restless. He spoke often with his warriors, their voices sharp, their eyes drifting toward the mountains. "We cannot stay here," he told Kor one evening. "The valley has been marked with blood. They will come again and again until nothing remains. We must move, seek a place the third people do not claim." But Kor shook his head. "The valley is ours. We have buried too much here to abandon it. If they come, we will fight. If we leave, we are prey forever." The disagreement spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. Some supported Kor, swearing never to yield the land that had kept them alive. Others sided with the feather-haired leader, arguing that survival mattered more than pride. The people fractured anew, voices rising, fists clenchying. In the midst of it, Kelra spoke again. Her words were clumsy, half-formed, but clear enough. She pointed toward the river and said a phrase that mingled both tongues. A command to walk together. The crowd froze. Some gasped, others bowed their heads. To hear such words from one so small struck deeper than any speech of chiefs or elders. For a heartbeat, hope flared. But hope, like fire, flickered. Some claimed the spirit spoke through her. Others whispered that she was a trick, a child born of division, not unity. And as always, doubt returned, circling like carrion birds above the wounded valley. The valley did not sleep easily after that night. Every rustle of leaves was a threat, every gust of wind through the grass a whisper of unseen steps. The children no longer played freely by the river. Mothers kept them close, their hands always reaching to pull them back from the edge of the water. Hunters moved in pairs or threes, no longer daring to tread the forest alone. Even laughter, when it came, was quiet, nervous, as though the forest itself might punish too much joy. But people are stubborn creatures, bound to life even when shadows gather. Slowly, routines returned. The women rebuilt the huts, weaving stronger frames from branches and sealing the walls with clay. The men reinforced the palisade, driving sharpened stakes into the earth, their sweat mingling with the soil. Children carried water, gathered kindling, sang songs half remembered from both tribes. And though fear lingered, the valley began to breathe again. Regan threw himself into the work, his arms and back hardened by endless labor. At night he returned to Lyra and Kelra, holding them close as though the strength of his body alone might shield them from all dangers. Lyra, though weary, carried herself with quiet resilience. She taught Kelra songs to hush her fears, melodies from her mother's tongue and from Regan's, blending them until they were no longer one or the other, but something new. Their daughter listened wide-eyed, humming back notes in strange but beautiful tones that made even the most hardened warriors pause outside their hut. Kor healed slowly from his wound. The spear that had pierced him left his arm stiff, his body weakened, yet he would not remain idle. Each morning he walked the camp, leaning on his axe as on a staff, his voice rising to bark orders at men half his age. Stand the stakes higher, he would growl. The wolves will leap if you give them space. Sharpen your blades. Blood dulls them faster than stone. And though some grumbled at the old man's sharpness, they obeyed, for none could deny that his wisdom was carved as deep as his scars. The feather-haired leader, restless as ever, sent scouts beyond the valley. They returned with troubling news. Strange fires burned in the forest, not from storms, but from camps hidden beyond the hills. More markings scarred the trees, spirals, jagged slashes, crude faces, the language of the third people. And more disturbing still, carcasses of deer left untouched, their throats slit, their bodies arranged in patterns on the ground. Sacrifices, the scouts whispered, offerings to whatever dark spirits the third people called upon. Tension grew sharper. Around the fire, debates flared into arguments. Some cried to abandon the valley, to flee before the third people gathered in numbers to great. Others swore to fight, to defend their homes no matter the cost. Regan, standing tall before them, declared, "We cannot run forever. If we leave once, we will leave again and again, until there is nowhere left to go. Here we stand, here we live." But still the doubts gnawed. Every man looked to his children, every woman to the meager food stores, and wondered whether pride was worth the risk. In those nights, Gray's absence grew heavier, his shadow stretching long across their thoughts. Was he out there, feeding the third people with secrets of their defenses? Or was he dead, bones bleaching under the forest sun? No answer came, and the silence was worse than truth. Kelra grew among it all, untouched by fear. She wandered between huts, babbling words that stitched both languages together, weaving fragments into strange sentences that no one had taught her. Children gathered around her, imitating her speech, laughing as they invented new words of their own. To some, it was a game. To others, it was unsettling. A language born not from tradition, but from change. One evening, as the fire burned low, Kelra stood in the center of the circle and sang. Her voice was small, but the song carried, clear and haunting. It was not a song known to either tribe, yet its melody echoed with both. The people listened in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with unease curling in their stomachs. When she finished, the valley was so quiet that even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. And in that silence, many felt the weight of the future pressing down, fragile, uncertain, but alive still. The shadows crept closer. Scouts reported seeing Gray's figure at the edge of the forest, standing among the trees, watching the valley but never stepping forth. Some swore he was changed, his skin marked with the same ash as the third people, his eyes hollow and strange. Others claimed it was only fear playing tricks in the night. But the thought festered. Had their own blood become the enemy? When the next full moon rose, the drums returned. Louder this time, stronger. Their rhythm no longer a test, but a call. Fires burned on the ridges beyond the valley. Dozens of them, too many to count. Shadows moved in the flickering glow, and the cries of the third people drifted down like smoke. The valley stood still, every soul knowing what was to come. And in the center of it all, Kelra slept in her mother's arms, her breath soft, her face peaceful, as if she dreamed of a world that was not yet broken. The night of the full moon burned with fire. From the ridges above the valley, the third people descended, their torches blazing, their voices rising in shrieks that pierced the soul. The ground trembled with the beat of drums, and shadows poured into the camp like a flood. This time, there was no test, no probing strike. It was war. The defenders were ready. Spears bristled at the palisade, arrows notched in trembling hands. Reagan stood at the front, his face streaked with ash, his eyes fixed on the horde. Beside him, the feather-haired leader lifted his blade, the steel glinting with firelight. And though age weighed his body, Kor stood too, his scarred face unflinching. His axe heavy but steady, the clash came like thunder. Spears met shields, fire leapt from torch to roof, screams filled the air. The third people fought with frenzy, their movements wild and brutal. But the defenders held their ground. Reagan roared as he drove his spear into one foe, then another, his body moving with desperation beyond strength. The feather-haired chief cut through attackers with ruthless precision. His feathers burned and blackened, but his strikes true. Kor fought like a tree in the storm, unyielding, each blow of his axe felling enemies though blood poured from his wound. And then came Gray. From the forest he emerged, painted in ash, bones strung around his neck, his eyes hollow as stone. He strode at the head of a band of third people, his voice joining their shrieks. The sight struck the camp like a knife, betrayal given flesh. Some faltered, some leapt, and rage tore through Reagan's chest. Gray, he shouted, his voice raw. The man did not answer. He leapt into the fray, his blade flashing against his own kin. The battle raged through the night. Fires devoured huts. The river glowed with reflections of flame. Blood stained the soil. Children huddled with their mothers in the caves, Kelra among them, her small hands clutching Lyra's dress. Yet even as terror gripped them, Kelra began to sing. Her voice was thin, trembling, but clear. The strange song she had sung before now rose again, weaving through the screams and the clash of steel. And in that moment, those who heard it felt a calm. A fire within stronger than fear, Reagan fought his way through the chaos. Seeking Gray, at last they met at the heart of the flames. Two men bound by blood and torn by hatred. Gray's eyes glimmered with madness, his face twisted by pain and rage. You chose them over us, he hissed, striking. Their blades clashed, sparks flying, fury meeting fury. The duel raged, neither giving ground. Reagan fought for his child, his people, his future. Gray fought for vengeance, for the ghosts of ancestors he believed betrayed. At last, with a cry that shook his soul, Reagan drove his spear into Gray's chest. The man staggered, eyes wide, the madness flickering, then fell into the fire's glow. Silence followed, broken only by the roar of battle elsewhere. But Gray's death broke the enemy's strength. The third people faltered, their cries dimming, their attacks weakening. And as dawn broke over the valley, they retreated at last, their shadows slipping back into the forest, leaving only smoke and silence behind. The camp was shattered, but not destroyed. Ash drifted through the air, the smell of blood and fire heavy. The people gathered in the ruins, their faces hollow but alive. Gor leaned on his axe, his body failing, but his eyes burning. He looked to Kelra, now cradled in Lyra's arms, her song fading into quiet hums. "She carries what we could not," he said, his voice a whisper of stone. "She is both, and she is more. If there is a future, it rests in her," no one argued. The valley, broken and scarred, seemed to listen. And in the hush after war, Kelra lifted her eyes to the rising sun, her gaze steady, her breath strong. The people rebuilt, not as the tribes, but as one. Gray's name was spoken no more, lost with the shadows he had chosen. The scars of battle remain, but so did the song of a child, a song that bound them. Fragile yet unbreakable dot, and so, in a valley where fire and blood had nearly ended all things, a new beginning took root. The world had not yet forgiven them, but they had chosen to live dot in the weeks that followed. The valley was quieter than it had ever been. The air still carried the smell of ash, and the earth bore black scars where fire had devoured huts and fences. But amid the ruin, life persisted. The people worked with a determination born of loss, their hands blistered from rebuilding, their voices hoarse from calling one another across the camp. Every morning, smoke rose once more from hearths, and every evening children's laughter, faint but real, threaded through the silence. The memory of Gray lingered like a wound. Some cursed his name, others mourned him in silence. For Reagan, the ache was sharper than rage. He had not only killed a foe, but a brother. At night, he sat by the river. The spear lay beside him and stared at the water. He thought of the boy Gray had been, of their hunts together, of the shared fire where they once swore to protect one another. The man he had slain was not that boy, and yet the shadow of both haunted him. Lyra would come to sit with him sometimes, Kelra asleep against her chest. She would not speak, only rest her hand on his, and in that touch he found enough strength to rise each morning. For her, too, the wound was deep. She had seen what hatred could do, what division could make of men. Yet she believed, stubbornly, that their child was proof the world could change. Kelra grew in those weeks as if the battle had watered her spirit. She learned to walk unsteadily between the huts, calling to children in words that blended both tongues. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was curiosity. Mothers smiled to see their children echo her speech. Fathers laughed when they mispronounced her strange syllables. And slowly, the camp began to weave itself together, not as two halves, but as one cloth. The feather-haired chief aged swiftly after the battle. His body, worn by years of war, yielded to the weight of peace. One evening, he called Reagan and Lyra to him. Kelra cradled in their arms. "You will lead now," he said, voice thin but steady. "Not with a spear alone, but with a child. She is the thread between us. Protect her, and you protect us all." When he died a few days later, they buried him at the edge of the forest, his feathers scorched but unbroken, his blade laid at his side. Both peoples gathered, their songs rising into tongues that melted into one. Gor lived long enough to see the palisade rebuilt, higher and stronger than before. Though his arm never healed, his voice carried across the camp like thunder. He told the young of battles fought and mistakes made, and when his time came, he faced it with the pride of one who had given all he could. His axe was hung above the new meeting place, a reminder of resilience. Seasons turned. The valley greened again, the river ran clear, and the scars of fire faded beneath new growth. But the people did not forget. At night, when the stars crowded the sky, they told their children of the great fire, of Gray's betrayal, of Kelra's song. And though the story was painful, it became more than tragedy. It became a lesson. Years later, when Kelra was old enough to understand, she would ask about that night, and Reagan would answer not with tales of blood, but with a single truth. We lived because we chose each other. And so the story, which had begun with caves and fire, with hunters and fear, ended not in extinction, but in a fragile new beginning. The valley endured, as did the people, not because they were strongest, but because they learned, at last, that strength alone was never enough.